Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do Tank, Adelphi Global, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. I'm your host, Alexandra Steinkraus, and in this series you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in a changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow Climate Diplomacy and Security on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Welcome back to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. When the International Court of Justice delivered its historic advisory opinion on climate change in July 2025, it did more than clarify legal obligations. It reframed climate action as a matter of human rights, justice, and global security. In this episode, we speak with Atieh Khatibi, a legal scholar and PhD researcher project assistant in the Research Center for Climate Law at the University of Graz, specializing in climate change law, environmental policy, climate security, and human rights. She's a trained mediator and has expertise in environmental decision-making, international law, and peace building. So in this month's episode, we'll explore what the ICJ's advisory opinion means in practice, who it arms with new legal tools, and what it demands of states and international organizations. So welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you, Alex, for having me. It's a truly pleasure to be with you here. Congratulations to you and Adelphi for making the 56th episode of Climate Diplomacy Podcast, which is fantastic. Thank you for all their efforts. And I think it's especially meaningful to talk about climate security from a legal perspective, because for a long time, these discussions have mostly been happening in political, international relations, or peace and security studies. But what we're seeing now, especially with the ICJ advisory opinion, is a shift. So I'm really glad to be part of this discussion today with you.
And we're really happy to have you here to help unpack a lot of these different legal instruments, like legal meanings, since a lot of our audience is very much focused on the policy side of things.
Right.
So then, in order to help set the scene, last year in July of 2025, the ICJ's advisory opinion on the obligations of states in respect of climate change has been called a watershed moment for international climate law, and remarkably, it was set in motion by a campaign initiated by 27 law students at the University of the South Pacific, whose advocacy ultimately led to the UN General Assembly requesting this opinion. Can you start us off by giving us an overview of what this opinion actually states, its core findings, and some of the obligations that it identifies?
Yes, absolutely. This opinion is really a landmark moment. And I think what makes it so powerful is that it doesn't just add something new, but it actually clarifies and it strengthens what was already there in international law. At its core, I can say that the ICJ is saying something quite simple, but very important. Climate action is no longer just a policy choice. It's a legal obligation tied to human rights and environmental protection. And what a court does is to ground this obligation in several well-established legal principles. So, for example, it highlights duties like prevention, like due diligence, like precaution, and also international cooperation. So when a state fails to meet these duties, it can be a breach of international law, and it can be a breach of legal responsibility that undermines human rights and increases risks to human security. So these are not new concepts, but the ICJ makes clear that they fully apply to climate change. And also in practical terms, this means that states are required to take action to reduce emissions, but also to protect people from climate impacts. So it's not only about mitigation, it's also about adaptation, it's about safeguarding human rights and human needs like access to water, to food, health, and housing. Another key takeaway I can mention is that cooperation is no longer optional. The court emphasizes that countries have a legal duty to cooperate through finance, through capacity building, through technology transfer. And the court makes clear that climate finance, including support for loss and damage, is not optional, but rather a legal obligation grounded in human rights and international law. Another really important point is that these obligations go beyond climate treaties like UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement. The court makes clear that they are rooted in broader international law, including human rights law and customary international law, which are legally binding. So even states that are not party to different climate agreements like UNFCCC or Paris Agreement, they are still bound by these duties. And I think one of the most transformative elements of the opinion is exactly this connection between climate change and human rights. The court explicitly recognizes that a healthy environment is essential for the enjoyment of fundamental human rights. As a result, I can say that the court recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as essential to the enjoyment of full spectrum of human rights. And states cannot fulfill their human rights obligation without protecting their environment. Also, one more thing that the opinion also strengthens the idea of accountability. It makes clear that states can be responsible not only for what they do, like emitting greenhouse gases, but also for what they fail to do. So if they don't take reasonable measures to prevent harm, or for example, if a country does not put proper rules or policies in place or enforce them, it will still be held responsible for climate harm that can constitute a breach of international law. And importantly, this extends to private actors as well. States have a duty to regulate companies and activities within their jurisdiction, even if the impacts are global. So overall, I can say, Alex, that this opinion is really shift the framing. Climate change is no longer just an environmental issue. It becomes a matter of legal responsibility, human rights, and global security. And that's why I think many people like you at the beginning of your question call this ICJ advisory opinion as a watershed moment.
Exactly. Thanks very much for giving a bit of context. I think especially if other people coming from climate, peace, and security, we've heard this a lot of this watershed moment. This is a huge development, but it's been very difficult to put tangibly what this actually means. So thanks very much for giving us this overview. Just as importantly, as you've laid out what this advisory opinion can do, how it can constitute a breach of international law, both making states required to act in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation and safeguarding human rights like the right to the environment. What does this advisory opinion not say? And what are some of the limits of this opinion?
Yeah, I think this is just as important because while the opinion is very powerful and as strong, as I mentioned very briefly, I think it also, as you correctly mentioned, it has some limitations and some shortcomings. First of all, it's important to remember that this is an advisory opinion, which means it is not legally binding in itself. So the court clarifies what the law requires, but it doesn't create a direct enforcement mechanism. A second limitation I can mention is that the court focuses more on defining obligations than on identifying specific violations. So it tells us what a state should do, like preventing harm or acting with due diligence or cooperating in good faith, but it leaves some room for interpretation when it comes to what exactly counts as a breach of international law. And that can make climate litigations more complex, especially for vulnerable communities trying to bring cases before the courts. Also, the opinion does not introduce entirely about climate security, which is a core of our discussion today in a formal sense. It clearly links climate change to risks such as displacement or resource scarcity and instability, but not explicitly mention any words to climate security. And of course, it's short of formally mentioning climate security in a legal category. And finally, the court strengthens principles like equity and responsibility. It doesn't fully resolve some of the deeper political tensions, especially between developed and developing countries. So questions around burden sharing, historical responsibility, and implementation gaps are still very much open. That said, even with these limitations, I can say that the opinion is still extremely significant, because what it does is raise the legal and reputational risks of inaction. It gives the states, civil society, and courts a much stronger basis to challenge insufficient climate action. And that in itself, I think, is a really major shift. So I would say the opinion doesn't solve everything, but it changes the rules of the game.
I think that's a really nice way to put it. It changes the rules of the game. I'll remember that. And I think especially in the current geopolitical climate that we're working with, as you mentioned, it raises the stakes when it comes to reputation and things like that, which is even more and more important as we move towards different things like hard security and narratives when it comes to human rights or protection of rule of law. I think it's a really exciting development. And you also mention that, of course, this is an advisory opinion, so there's no direct enforcement mechanism. But I do want to talk a little bit about these obligations, enforcement, and accountability. So you've also co-authored a policy brief with one of my lovely co-workers, Emma Whitaker, in January of this year. And within that policy brief, you've written that this opinion signals that climate action is now a legal obligation, not a policy preference, which you've already hit on in this conversation as well. So what are some of the practical diplomatic consequences of this distinction for things like multilateral negotiations, like the UNFCCC process, for bilateral agreements, but also for domestic policymaking?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice, for this great question, because I think it's really important to also consider ICJ advisor opinion from a very practical perspective. And I think this distinction is really at the heart of why ICJ matters so much in practice, as we also mentioned with your lovely and wonderful colleague, Emma, in Adelphi in this policy brief. Because once climate action is framed as a legal obligation, it fundamentally changes how states engage, not just politically, but diplomatically and institutionally. And I think we can see this shift across 3 levels, which I will mention now, in multilateral, bilateral, and domestic levels. At the multilateral level, especially through a process like UNFCCC and COP negotiations, the ICJ provides a much stronger legal foundation for collective actions among states. It makes clear that countries are expected to uphold all relevant international laws, including COP's decisions, which creates a new opportunity for cooperation for countries to work together and strengthen collective action. Maybe I can say something now. I can vividly remember one of the sentences from our professors in our classes, that this ICJ advisory opinion is a very comprehensive course for international law and climate change law. So anybody would like to know anything about climate change in the context of international law, so they can only go through this ICJ advisory opinion. Of course, it's a very long document, 154 pages, if I remember correctly, but it's very comprehensive. So you don't need to register at any courses. I think reading this ICJ opinion, is enough.
That's a really good tip and trick. Just read the ICJ opinion if you want to.
Yeah,
into
right.
This topic. Yeah. Or listen to this podcast episode.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a very brief summarizing of all the ICJ advisory opinions. Yeah, I'll continue my answer. And these COP decisions and negotiations has important consequences. It means that discussions around mitigation, adaptation, or climate finance are no longer only about political negotiations. They are also about legal responsibility and accountability. So, for example, when states submit or update their NDCs, or, for example, NAPs, National Adaptation Plans, there is now a stronger expectation that these are aligned not only to climate goals, but also with protecting human rights and maintaining stability and maintaining human security as well. Going to bilateral level, I think the implications are also quite interesting. This legal framing encourages states to integrate climate obligations into their cooperation strategies, whether that's through climate finance, for example, technology transfer, or joint adaptation initiatives. Because again, support for vulnerable countries is no longer seen as optional or purely political. It's increasingly understood as part of broader legal duty to cooperate. And that can reshape diplomatic relationships, especially between high-emitting and vulnerable states, by creating stronger expectations around fairness, around responsibility, and support. Then at domestic level, I would say the impact is perhaps even more concrete. I will explain. Governments are now expected to translate these international obligations into national laws, policies, and planning process. So that means integrating climate considerations into national adaptation plans, into development strategies, or into regulatory frameworks, but also doing so in a way that is rights-based and inclusive. The opinion also highlights the need to bring in human security and conflict sensitivity, which is a really, really important shift. It means that climate policy is no longer just about emissions or infrastructure. It's also about preventing instability. It's also about addressing inequality and protecting vulnerable communities. And I think this is particularly important in today's context, where we see increasing climate impacts, but also a very complex geopolitical landscape with shifting priorities and sometimes fragmented cooperation between states. In that context, I think that the ICJ opinion acts as a kind of anchor. It provides a shared legal framework, but at the same time, the opinion also makes clear that legal clarity alone is not enough. The real challenge is implementation, how states actually integrate these principles into policy and practice, and how they ensure that the needs of the most vulnerable are prioritized. So ultimately, I would say the shift from policy preference to legal obligation transforms climate diplomacy into something much more structured and much more accountable.
I think this challenge of implementation also is certainly echoed across a lot of different disciplines and topic areas. We've talked quite a bit about this moral and political weight that the ICJ advisory opinion carries. Not to keep stating it over and over, but I think especially for a policy audience, this idea that there is no direct enforcement mechanism is often a bit of a gray area that can be very difficult to understand how to move forward. So how do we move from this legal clarity to real world accountability? And what leverages does this opinion actually give to states, civil society, and also climate litigants pursuing cases in domestic or even international courts?
Yes, that's the really key and challenging question, because as you said, the ICJ opinion is not legally binding in itself. And so implementing is really challenging, and especially how we translate that legal clarity into actual accountability is really challenging. And I think what the opinion does is not to create enforcement directly, because it is not its purpose in nature, but to significantly strengthen the tools that already exist. I mean, right? First of all, it provides a much clearer legal standard. It spells out that states have duties like prevention, due diligence, and protecting human rights in the context of climate change. And I think that clarity is extremely powerful, because it gives courts, it gives policymakers and advocates a stronger basis to assess whether a state's actions or even inaction falls short of international law and constitutes a breach of international law and legal responsibility. So for climate litigation, this is a big shift. These legal principles are rooted in customary international law, which is legally binding. I should actually focus on this, that customary international law is legally binding in international law. So these principles that I repeated several times, like due diligence or preventing harm, precautionary, these are the customary international law principles, which are completely legally binding and rooted in international human rights law and international law in general. So if states fail to, for example, take measures with due diligence or take measures in a cooperation in good faith with other countries, they will fail to protect human rights as well. So litigants can now rely on the ICJ advisory opinion to argue that insufficient climate action as a breach of international law and legal obligations. And importantly, the opinion also confirms that these obligations go beyond climate treaties and are rooted in broader international law, like human rights law. And that opened doors to pursue accountability, as I mentioned earlier. And one more thing that the opinion raises the legal and reputational risks of inaction. So decisions like expanding fossil fuel extraction or delaying climate policies are now more exposed to legal challenge, threatening their global reputation. That can influence diplomatic behavior, negotiations, and even domestic policymaking, because governments are more aware that their actions or inactions could be contested. And for civil society, I think opinion is very powerful advocacy tool. It provides a very clear, authoritative statement from the highest international court that climate action is a legal obligation linked to human rights. So in practice, moving from clarity to accountability requires creative legal strategies, for example, using national courts, regional mechanisms, and different legal pathways to enforce these obligations. For example, governments now have a clearer duty to regulate private actors. So civil society or affected communities can challenge projects like fossil fuels developments by arguing that the states failed to meet its due diligence or preventing obligations. And behind courts, there are also political and diplomatic uses. So states, especially vulnerable ones, can use the opinion in their negotiations to demand stronger climate action, finance, or cooperation, and framing these not as requests, but as legal expectations. So I can say that as actually my concluding remarks, it gives actors across the systems, states, courts, and civil society a much stronger foundation to demand accountability.
I think that provides a fairly positive outlook. And before we get into some of these more lessons in real-world applications, I also just want to come back quickly to looking at some of these different processes, multilateral, bilateral, as well as domestic. And I was wondering how fast things move, or if there's any kind of a time delay in seeing some of these obligations, both moral, like legal, take effect. So could we expect in the upcoming COP in the fall, hosted by Australia and Turkey, already some of this advisory opinion coming into play for the next COP? Or how long for things like the development cooperation strategies or even domestic policy would you expect to see some of these like strengthened principles seen?
I think, we can expect it. It's still difficult.
Yes, fair. Timeline-wise, I'm like, but when? We want to see, when can we see it?
But at least we can be hopeful to see the outcomes of ICJ advisory opinion into the next round of negotiation, let's say in next COP, because I think many researchers and many legal scholars keep talking about the implications of ICJ advisory opinion. And we can see different papers about the importance of climate change in the context of international legal framework. So I think now in the global community, attentions draw more than before an ICJ advisory opinion and how to use these shared legal foundations in their negotiations. Because as I also mentioned, that if they put proper policies and rules, not only in the domestic level, but also in their negotiations, in bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements in the top of the negotiations, they can also show the global community that not only we are meeting the climate goals, but also we're trying to including human rights obligations and human security and stability in our policies. So then they can actually create more collectively negotiations with other states. So maybe actually it's difficult to say that next COP would be a great time to see the remarkable outcomes in the next COP. But at least we can expect and we can be optimistic to see something more remarkable happen in the next COPs with these legal foundations. And I hope that the states are becoming more aware of this tool, this legal tool. And I think that could be a task of civil society or some NGOs to raise awareness about this ICJ advisory opinion, or like this podcast. Thank you so much to you, Alex and Adolfi, because I think, yeah, it's true, because maybe it's challenging for some states and even for people to read some legal documents. As I mentioned, it's like 154 pages. And of course, it happens also for governmental authorities. So they need some summaries and brief of this ICJ, especially from a practical perspective, how they can use in practice. And I think these tools like these podcasts or other papers or, I don't know, policy brief like what we did before in early January, they are very good tools to raise awareness about ICJ and how to use this tool in practice, like maybe next COPs negotiations.
Agreed, especially since so many different foreign ministries or different offices, different governments that can use this as a tool to further its work. I mean, oftentimes many people are coming from the policy perspective. There's a legal department or people with these backgrounds, but there's so many different applications that having it spelled out in a very practical way and as short as concise as possible is always a good approach. And then one of the things that I think has been a red thread throughout this conversation is how this advisory opinion makes a powerful argument for how inseparable climate and human rights are from this rule of law perspective, and this idea that a healthy environment is a precondition for human dignity and the enjoyment of some very core rights. So what rights are most exposed to climate harm, and also whose rights are most at risk?
If I want to say what is most powerful contributions of ICJ opinion, I would definitely mention the connection between climate change and human rights, because it really makes clear that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's fundamentally a human rights issue. And the court identifies several core rights that are particularly exposed. First of all, the right to life. All of us, I think, know that climate change directly threatens lives through extreme weather events, heat waves, flooding, and also through a slower process like sea level rise. And what's really important is that the court connects these to displacement, which is really interesting. If you read the ICJ opinion, it highlights that people who are faced to move because of climate impacts still have to be protected, including under principles in international law like non-refoulement. So this is a big step, I think, in recognizing that climate displacement is not just a humanitarian issue, but also legal and human rights concern. The second key right is the right to health. Climate impacts like heat stress, air pollution, unsafe water and food insecurity, all of them are already affecting public health in very different ways. And the court makes clear that the states have an obligation to take both mitigation and adaptation measures to protect health and stabilize communities. Then there is the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes access to food, water, and housing. Because we all know that climate change undermines all of these through droughts, floods, ecosystem degradation, and these can affect people's homes, livelihoods, and sense of security. But beyond individual rights, I think it's equally important to look at who is most affected by human rights violations. The court clearly states that climate impacts are not distributed equally. They disproportionately affect vulnerable and marginalized groups like women, like children and indigenous peoples, migrants, and persons with disabilities. So these groups have fewer resources, less access to credits, less access to decision makings and power, and more exposed to environmental risk. So climate change doesn't just create new risks, it also intensifies existing inequalities, especially in structure. And that's why the court stresses that responses must be inclusive, must be non-discriminatory, and ensure access to justice. So maybe we can expect in the next COPs negotiations to have more inclusive and non-discriminatory decisions at the end of the COPs. And then we can say that, okay, states have also attention to some principles in this ICJ advisory opinion, because it mentions several times in this opinion that the policies and the responses must be inclusive. And I would say that all of this is really grounded in one central idea, which was mentioned in this advisory opinion, the right to a healthy environment. The complete name of this right is the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So without a safe and stable environment, it becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible, to fully realize rights such as health, life, and adequate living conditions.
I think this has been really helpful in this first part of the conversation to unpack what exactly the advisory opinion can do, what it can't do, but also a bit more tangibly, like different things that it can trigger, but also some of this rights-based approach and what is most affected by the idea of the right to a healthy environment. So coming a bit to some lessons and real-world applications, you've also worked on projects including the International Carbon Sequestration Project, the Hamon Wetland Conservation and Management Initiative, and the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Project in Iran, a region where environmental degradation and political fragility intersect acutely. So I want to take a little bit closer look at Iran first, particularly the conditions that built up into the lead up of the nationwide protests that erupted at the end of last year and have been very prevalent in different news cycles. And the report that you co-authored maps some of these most prevalent climate security pathways and how responses to them have been informed by the ICJ opinions. So I know that the advisory opinion stops short of mentioning climate security explicitly, but that certainly doesn't mean that it isn't there or it isn't present. So what are some of the most significant climate security risks in Iran, and how did linkages between climate stress and socioeconomic grievances shape some of these conditions for the unrest?
Thank you so much, Alex, for bringing Iran up, which is really important to talk about one of the fragile contexts where climate and security dynamics are very visible. So thank you so much for mentioning to Iran. I think if we look at the main climate security risk pathways in Iran, several stands out. One of the most significant that I think you would also hear about that is water insecurity and water scarcity. I can say that Iran has been facing long-term droughts over extraction of groundwater and mismanagement of water resources, and water stress is one of the key pathways through which climate risks can translate into instability, because it directly affects agriculture, livelihoods, and local economies. In many regions, especially in southern part of Iran, this has led to declining agriculture productivity, loss of income, and also increasing pressure on local communities. A second major issue is ecosystem degradation due to many projects, especially dam construction over rivers in Iran. I was reading a report this morning. Some experts believe that after international sanctions, which of course trigger excessive dam building as a tool for hydroelectric power generation, led to drying up of wetlands and water resources. When wetlands dries up or land becomes degraded, people lose not only natural resources, that their livelihood depends on that, but also economic opportunities. And these can increase vulnerability and displacement. One of examples I can briefly mention is Hamon wetlands in the south of Iran, where it's located on Afghanistan and Iran border, where drying has happened due to several reasons, such as declining rainfall and climate change impacts, as well as reduced water input from Afghanistan after dam construction over the Helmand River on the top, and the lack of compliance with water treaties between Iran and Afghanistan drafted in 1972. So transboundary water resources like Hamon wetlands in Iran I think, are potential sources of regional conflicts and tensions. If we look at the local level, drying up of the Hamun wetlands has led to sand and dust storms, which is visible, and it could also transfer to the central parts of Iran, not only in the southern part of Iran. For example, I lived in Tehran, and we could also feel the sand and dust storm coming from south part of Iran, but we're living in the central part of Iran. Air pollution, which have resulted in infectious and respiratory disease, and people have been forced to migrate, especially farmers and fishermen. And finally, we see risks linked to food insecurity and economic pressures in Iran, where climate impacts disrupts a production system and increases prices, adding further pressure to already fragile economic conditions. But what's really important and what climate security approach highlights is that these environmental pressures don't act in isolation. Unfortunately, many people and experts keep talking and talking about political, social, and economic crisis, inflation, currency collapse, corruption, and repression in Iran, which all led to the recent protests in the early days of this year in January. But I think what is missing is environmental breakdown, specifically due to climate change impacts in Iran. As I mentioned earlier, Iran is experiencing not only one pathway of climate security, but a combination of different risks, which altogether impact human rights enjoyment. And in one word, life is a struggle for living in peace with yourself and with dignity. They interact with socioeconomic grievances. I will give you an example. When water shortages in Iran affects farmers, it's not just an environmental issue where you can see some protests of farmers in central cities of Iran, like Isfahan over Zayan Darud River last year. When farmers see the lakes and rivers that used to be full of water in the last years are now drying up, it's obvious that people become depressed and angry and turn into protests coming on the streets. When ecosystems degrade, it leads to unemployment, it leads to migration to cities and increased pressure on infrastructure and services in urban areas, particularly in large cities in Iran, such as Isfahan, Tehran, Tabriz, and Mashhad. From 2003 to 2019, Iran lost an estimated 211 cubic kilometers of groundwater, and there is a high rate of land subsidence in big cities that host the largest number of migrants who are coming to the urban areas to secure their lives. So when environmental challenges are combined with inequality, with mismanagement, or lack of effective response, they can contribute to frustration and loss of trust, as we saw in the recent protest, which of course started from many years ago. But now we can see in the media that the people are coming on the street, but the reasons are rooted in different reasons, started from many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So the civil society have been fighting for many years up to now. So the protests cannot be explained by governance factors alone, but environmental issues and climate-related security risks clearly played a role in shaping the conditions in which unrest become more likely and become more visible. In Iran, like other fragile countries, climate change is not just an environmental challenge. It's deeply connected to economic conditions, to governance, and ultimately to peace and stability.
Certainly. Thanks very much. I think also the way you've connected these different climate security pathways to the prevention of enjoyment of different fundamental, these core rights that we've been talking about, is also really important, that these legal aspects also aren't completely separate for things like, I think our listeners, the climate, peace, and security policy community is also very familiar with a lot of these pathways. But in many ways, there's a direct connection with human rights that we often maybe don't make as a more community of practice. So I'm really glad that in outlining the linkages in Iran, you could also bring that a little bit closer. But of course, Iran is one example of a situation of active conflict. And with the increasing number of armed conflicts and political violence around the world, this trend is certainly going in this direction. So does this change how we think about the reach of the ICJ advisory opinion, its limits, especially in these situations of active conflict and state fragility?
Thank you so much, Alex, for these great questions, especially on the tensions we are seeing in Iran across the Middle East and, of course, more broadly around the world. Honestly speaking, I think this is really important and difficult question because situations of active conflict and fragility really test both the reach and limits of ICJ advisory opinion. On the one hand, the increasing number of conflicts actually makes the opinion more relevant, not less. Because what we're seeing globally is that climate risks like water scarcity, food insecurity, and displacement are increasingly interacting with political instability and violence. And the ICJ opinion responds directly to that by framing climate change not only as an environmental issue, but as something closely linked to human rights, to peace and stability. So in that sense, it expands how we think about climate action. It suggests that addressing climate risk is a part of preventing instability and protecting societies, especially in fragile contexts. And it also strengthens the argument that even in complex political situations, states still have legal obligations to prevent harm, act with due diligence, and cooperate. But at the same time, these contexts also highlight the limits of the opinion, because in situations of active conflict, the main challenge is that it is not easy to insist on legal obligations and legal responsibility. It seems that international law and legal obligations lose their significance under the benefits of each of the states involved in the tensions and conflicts. So it's very difficult to expect the states actually comply legal obligations and to expect enforcement mechanism of legal obligations and responsibility. Or even I can say that international and national security becomes on top, and human security and human rights are being addressed less. And this is really challenging. Even if obligations are clearly defined, the states affected by a conflict may lack the capacity, resources, or political stability to actually fulfill them. There is also the issue that the ICJ opinion does not come with a direct enforcement mechanism. So in fragile or conflict-affected settings where governance structures are already under pressure, translating legal obligations into practice becomes even more difficult and challenging. And at the same time, the broader global trend of geopolitical fragmentation and shifting alliances can slow down cooperation, which is actually a key requirement under the ICJ framework. So I would say the opinion provides a very strong normative framework, let's say, but its impact depends heavily on political and institutional conditions on the ground. And I think it's the reality of all international laws and policies. And some experts and scholars are keep saying that international law in nature is not legally binding. And it's all about the states. It's all about their political will. It's all about implementation on the ground. We have good rules, but we don't have good enforcement of the law. It's a reality that we should face it. So overall, I would say that the trend of increasing conflict doesn't reduce the importance of the ICJ opinion, but it does make clear that legal guidance alone is not enough.
So then to look forward and maybe put it very concretely, of course, you mentioned that the ICJ opinion and its advisory opinion in itself is not enough. And when it comes to different roles of different groups, when it comes to those who are most responsible, what do high-emitting states concretely need to do differently in light of this opinion? Maybe very concretely of what it says, but then also a bit aspirational of what needs to be done and what should be done.
If climate action is a legal obligation, then the states need to align their policies, investments, and decisions much more closely with that legal standards. And there are a few areas where the shift becomes very visible. First, on climate targets, for example, high-emitting states need to treat the ICJ opinion as authoritative guidance when updating, for example, their NDCs. That means not only increasing ambition, but also setting clear and binding timelines, particularly for phasing out fossil fuel subsides. Because continuing to support a fossil fuel is increasingly difficult to justify in light of the court's emphasis on prevention and due diligence. A second key area is climate finance and international support and cooperation. The opinion reinforces that cooperation is not optional, so high-emitting states are expected to provide adequate support, especially to fragile and vulnerable contexts. And the third, there is a very important shift at the domestic policy level. Governments need to integrate climate and human rights consideration into their decision-making process. For example, in permitting systems, in public engagement with for example, civil societies and export credit possible policies. This means introducing climate human rights tests to ensure that major projects or investments are consistent with international obligations. And very closely related to that is the issue of risk awareness and accountability. So the ICJ opinion increases both the legal and reputational risk of inaction that we discussed during the podcast because it's really important, and the importance of ICJ is actually rooted in this aspect. So high-emitting states need to take proactive steps to align their laws, policies, and regulatory frameworks with these obligations and to recognize that insufficient action can now be challenged, if we can say more easily or effectively. This also includes greater transparency. For example, publishing legal and reputational risk assessments for new fossil fuel projects such as oil, gas, or coal can help demonstrate whether these decisions are consistent with due diligence and prevention standards or not. So I can say that the shift is from voluntary leadership to accountable governance is visible and expected from the ICJ advisory opinion.
So I'm looking at some other stakeholder groups before we end the conversation for today. When it comes to groups like vulnerable states, international organizations, as well as civil society, what actions stand out to you as the most urgent or the most promising? And maybe to also close us out on, again, the optimistic note, where in all of this do you find the biggest reason for having an optimistic outlook on the future?
Yeah, exactly. As you said, the ICJ also creates some entry points for action across different actors, like civil society. So if I want to start with vulnerable states, I think one of the most urgent opportunities is to use the ICJ opinion as a form of legal leverage. So in process like NDC updates or national adaptation plans, they can rely on the opinion to justify stronger demands for adaptation, for loss and damage, and financing. There is also a really important role in engaging with mechanisms like the Loss and Damage Fund to ensure that support actually reaches those most at risk in a fair and timely way. And at the national level, I would say putting human rights and climate security risk assessments into planning is key, especially with approaches like early relocation or scaling up social protection before a crisis escalates. For regional and international organizations, I think the role is really about translation and coordination. They can help turn the ICJ ruling into concrete frameworks and strategies and bridge the gap between climate, human rights, and security agendas. This includes providing technical support for countries, like reviewing NDCs or strengthening early warning systems, but also coordinating responses to cross-border risks such as migration or water scarcity, especially in transboundary rivers and areas. And importantly, they can integrate climate security more systematically into peace and security discussions and also monitor how states are implementing their obligations. And for civil society, I would say the ICJ opinion is very powerful tool. It can be used for strategic litigation, for advocacy, for public mobilization, holding both governments and corporations accountable for climate harm. But beyond that, I think that civil society plays a key role in ensuring that communities are actually involved in decision making, and climate responses are inclusive and grounded in real needs. And not to forget to mention that building coalitions across sectors like human rights, environment, and peace building is especially promising in pushing for more integrated solutions. And regarding the last part of your question, Alex, I think...
Ooh, that doesn't sound as optimistic, the pause.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the way to describe more positively and hopefully, but I think my optimism comes from exactly these shifts. As I already mentioned, I think the ICJ opinion creates a shared legal foundation and normative framework that different actors can use in their own ways. It is not enough. Of course, we know that, and we should not forget that political will and even the will of actors, other actors, even civil society and vulnerable communities and different agents for changes. But still, it creates a remarkable stepping stone. It strengthens accountability, but it also opens a new forms of cooperation and gives a chance to more voices to be heard. So yeah, I think we must be optimistic.
Exactly. No, and I think with the whole conversation we've been having, there is very clearly reason for optimism. One of the things that you've mentioned that I think strikes the strongest chord with me is that the advisory opinion can be used as a tool to strengthen a lot of things that are in existence. So hopefully when it comes to things like COP and the Loss and Damage Fund, something where it's there, but it hasn't quite seen the commitments that are needed in order to make it successful or functional. Hopefully tools like this and the increased both like normative or moral pressures will help increase pressure and see more commitment, see more success.
Yeah, exactly right.
Exactly. So I think you've given us a lot to at least have an optimistic lens about, and it was really lovely having you here for the conversation today. And I will also link the policy brief within the description of the podcast episode for those who want to do a bit of a deeper dive into the policy brief that you've written along with Emma. The link will be there.
Thank you so much, Atieh, for having me. It's been a really pleasure to be part of this conversation. And we talked about climate security in different areas like international relations, political science, and peace and security. But I think this podcast and also the policy brief that I also highly recommend to all of the listeners to this podcast, that it was like a stepping stone to talk about climate security from a legal perspective. And I think it's really important because we've heard a lot about political issues and policy choices, but it's good to know about the legal dimensions as well. Maybe we can expect for more concrete actions at the end. So thank you so much again, Alex. And hopefully that means moving toward solutions that are not only effective, but also fair and inclusive. And thank you again. It's been a great discussion with you, Alex, today.
Thank you so much. I think you've wrapped that up perfectly then. So this was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We'll be back with another episode in a few weeks, and you can follow the latest updates on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, Climate Diplomacy and Security. And thank you for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.